mentioned his long telegram often. Of course, it's one of the sort of foundational pieces of American foreign policy that anyone reads who's interested in international relations. He gave an interview in 1998. I don't know if you remember this, to Thomas Friedman. And it was
I do remember.
It was in the New York Times. It was titled "Foreign Affairs, Now a Word from X." And of course, X was because
George
it was signed X when it was published in Foreign Affairs. His
anonymously.
Anonymously. And I want to read some passages from this article because I find it to be incredibly prescient, to the point that it's disturbingly prescient.
On Kennan's part, not on Friedman's part.
On Kennan's part. Yeah, no, not on Friedman's part. I'm going to just take pieces of it because they really make this point. He said, I think when referring to the expansion of NATO, he says,
this is George Kennan speaking.
This is George Kennan speaking.
Speaking to Friedman.
He said, yes. He said, I think it is the beginning of a new Cold War. I think the Russians will gradually react quite adversely, and it will affect their policies. I think it is a tragic mistake. It shows so little understanding of Russian history and Soviet history. Of course, there is going to be a bad reaction from Russia. And then the NATO expanders will say that we always told you it is how the Russians are, but this is just wrong. And he ended the conversation, according to Friedman, saying, this has been my life, and it pains me to see it so screwed up in the end. Wow.
Yeah, I remember it vividly, and I even remember George talking to some of us at Princeton about what he was going to say, and not only to Friedman, but when he went to Washington to testify, because he was a sought-after figure still. The takeaway for me is how prescient George Kennan was, how clear the cautionary warning he was giving about NATO expansion, and how little Friedman took away from it, personally.
Yes, well, he's been a cheerleader of...
That's right, because his columns have not been in the spirit of George Kennan.
A lot of people got carried away. You know, I think that's also something that I think is easily forgotten from that period. People got swept up.
You're talking about NATO expansion,
not just NATO expansion, yes, in that period, but I mean also people got swept up in the post-Cold War world. This idea of American exceptionalism, moral superiority, that America was now basically, it was the full spectrum dominance idea that we were going to become the global hegemon, number one. We were going to set the international agenda. We were going to drive it forward, and no one was going to get in our way. And in fact, I think a couple of years ago, or a year ago maybe it was, or 2 years ago, I've got the information in my rundown for subscribers. These documents were made public because you'd been talking about this for years, that Gorbachev, who you know very well, was given assurances by Jim Baker that NATO would not move an inch, not 1 inch to the east. And some of this information was made published. So it's now
the transcripts of the discussions were made
a historical fact. I want to read one more thing, though, from Kennan's interview. He said, I was particularly bothered because you mentioned that he testified before the Senate, and he referred to the Senate conversation as superficial and ill-informed, the debate in the Senate. And he said, I was particularly bothered by the references to Russia as a country dying to attack Western Europe. Don't people understand? Our differences in the Cold War were with the Soviet communist regime, and now we are turning our backs on the very people who mounted the greatest bloodless revolution in history to remove that Soviet regime. That also really stuck out to me because the Cold War lasted how long?
Well, people call it that Cold War. We're in a new Cold War.
Yeah, sure, but it lasted...
40, people usually say 40
It
years.
lasted a very long time. The fact that it ended without a shot, it's one of those things where when you look back, I think for most of us, I don't think we really fully appreciate how lucky we are. And you've made this point time and again, and I think it's so important. During the Cold War, and I want you to make it yourself, during the Cold War, Americans, we were all taught to be afraid of nuclear war. It was in the culture, especially in the early years. The Cuban Missile Crisis, there was real anxiety that we could see a nuclear apocalypse. We have, in some ways, we don't have by number necessarily, but as you've made the point, we have, I think, intermediate range nuclear missiles now that we didn't have, that we got rid of in the 80s under Reagan and Gorbachev. In some ways, tensions are higher and we have less awareness of these weapons and the potential for this type of war.
Well, look at the so-called discussion or debate about Ukraine going on in Congress. driven by people who want to get Trump for some misdeed he did with Ukraine. And they're bringing forward all these career diplomats to testify who are so-called Ukrainian experts, Americans, and who were stationed there. But if you read what they say, it's horrifying. For them, and they say this candidly, the war against Russian aggression has never ended. Ukraine is the front line. We have to stop Russia in Ukraine, or it's going to be, I don't know where, San Francisco. I mean, this is exactly what we were told and what Kennan was protesting whenever that was, 40 or 50 years ago. It's all back. It's preposterous, but it's also really, really dangerous. That's why in my book, War with Russia, ? I make the argument this really is a new Cold War. And we need to think about it as such because there were lessons we learned that enabled us to survive the preceding Cold War that we have not learned yet. And things are really, really dangerous. I mean, I make the argument in the book that this new Cold War, this has been my main theme for the last few years, this new Cold War, which your generation gets from my generation, whereas my generation got the last one from our predecessors, you get this one from us. This is more dangerous. It's interesting how this war went and the limits to what you can. I mean, I've been excluded from mainstream media now for several years, but nonetheless, I have an audience. So I'm always curious the extent to which I persuaded people of what I think they need to be persuaded about. People gradually, there were a lot of pushback on this when I began this, at least in 2014, if not before, arguing we were now in a new Cold War with Russia. People said, no, that's not possible. I remember Condi Rice said Cohen's got it all wrong and gave the reasons. I don't think anybody today reasonable would deny we're in a new Cold War with Russia. But I go on to make a secondary point that's more important to me. This one's more dangerous. We can't say, okay, it's a new Cold War. We survived the preceding. So the question becomes, asked to me, why is it more? In what way? Now, in my book, War with Russia, I have a chapter which gives 10 reasons, but that's too many. I never should have given that many. You should get down. Something for all writers to learn. You're not going to give people 10 reasons and persuade them. Give them 3 or 4 and you got a good chance of winning over. But stop and think. Unlike the preceding Cold War, this new Cold War is on Russia's borders, the epicenter, the political epicenter, Ukraine and the Baltics. The preceding Cold War was in faraway Berlin. Think of the possibilities of mishap. And some of them have already been reported. Some of them haven't been reported.
Yeah.
Look at these buildups. I mean, massive American NATO buildups on Russia borders. There was nothing like that during the preceding Cold War. To the extent that we had combat with the Soviet Union, the preceding Cold War, it was through proxies in what we used to call the Third World, Ethiopia. I mean, if something went wrong in Ethiopia, it wasn't existential. If something goes wrong in Ukraine or in the Baltic area, Poland, Lithuania, Latvia, Estonia, where NATO is building up, if something goes wrong militarily, you're talking about war with Russia. We're told in a hush way, because they don't want to announce it officially, that something called deconfliction is going on. Have you heard about this?
No.
This means that the Russian generals and the American generals have a private secret correspondence where when there's the possibility of military conflict, they're in touch to be sure there is none. So this tells us 2 things very important, that the military people themselves see the risk of military conflict, American, Russian. The New York Times may not see it, but the big military
Who's
people
reporting
see
this? Where are you hearing
You
this?
can read it anywhere. Google deconfliction talks. Okay. That there is a process. I assume I don't know if it's on email or closed telephone, what the communication is, but you can even read about it in the paper occasionally called deconfliction. Deconfliction. It was in Syria, it's in Ukraine, it's wherever too many places that American and Soviet military power are eyeball to eyeball, that the generals on both sides have kind of a constant process. They alert each other to maneuvers. If something goes out of whack, they immediately say, please don't attack us. That was a mistake. We're sorry. We'll make remedies. But this tells you that the people who know there's actually a risk, unlike that existed during the preceding Cold War. So what are we discussing in Washington instead? This is what Senate hearings should be about. You mentioned new weapons. So the Russians have developed something called hypersonic weapons, missiles. You heard about them.
Sure.
The history of this is very important for Americans to recognize. Once upon a time, there was a wonderful treaty called the Anti-Ballistic Missile Treaty, the ABM Treaty. It prohibited the United States and the Soviet Union. We were the only, well, there may have been other signatories, but we had the weapons, from deploying anti-ballistic missile. And it was one of the wisest treaties ever, right? Because it meant that if planners in Moscow or in Washington knew that they attacked the other, they were going to get obliterated too. It was called mutually assured destruction. And that protected us for decades. But now suddenly the United States says it has a weapon, an anti-ballistic missile that can stop anybody from striking the United States. That makes the Russians think maybe we'll do a first strike. And that's something you never want anybody to think.
But no one really believes that missile defense systems actually are credible, right?
Well,
certainly not for the type of force that the Russians can deploy.
Now you get into Dr. Strangelove reasoning here. You know, I assume your listeners are aware of Dr. Strangelove movie. Where he said, well,
Stanley Kubrick.
Yeah, we won't lose more than 40 million, and they'll be replaced by healthy women and men.
Well, that was Kissinger. Kissinger, I think, had written his PhD on limited nuclear war. Did he not?
But before we leave this, stop and think what this discussion is about.
Sure.
I mean, stop and think about it.
Yeah.
And one reason we should stop and think about it is that almost none of our political candidates who want to be president of the United States are talking about it. I mean, this is what they should be talking about, one of the things. And the reason they don't talk about it, it's not well reported. There's no awareness of it. So the fact that we've come to a point where military strategists on each side are contemplating how they could get away with a first strike and without retaliation, that we're back to that again. Come back, something that we thought was behind us. And it's not being discussed in the political discourse in a presidential year by the Washington Post or the New York Times or such newspapers. That is why, one reason why I say the new Cold War is more dangerous, because the dangers of the old Cold War were discussed all the time. And those of the new Cold War are scarcely recognized.
I have a lot of thoughts about